The Galactic Council chamber loomed high above the capital city, a monolithic structure of polished obsidian and reinforced alloys. It was meant to symbolize unity across the vast reaches of space, yet within its walls, unity often took the form of merciless law. Today was no different. Lyra knelt on the cold platform at the center of the chamber, her hands bound in energy cuffs that glowed faintly against her pale skin. She had stopped struggling long ago. The Council had no interest in truth, only in maintaining their grip on power. The air was thick with the murmurs of alien dignitaries, their voices a mixture of disinterest and quiet satisfaction. "Let the accused rise," a deep, resonant voice commanded. High Arbiter Jarthos leaned forward, his golden exoskeleton catching the dim light. His compound eyes regarded Lyra with a detached curiosity, as if she were an insect pinned to a display. Lyra lifted her head but did not stand. "I am innocent." Her voice, though soft, carried through the hall. "Innocence is not for you to decide," Jarthos replied smoothly. "You have been found guilty of sedition against the Council, of conspiring to undermine our authority. The evidence is irrefutable." There was no evidence. Only fabricated reports and testimonies from those who sought to erase her influence. She had spent years negotiating peace between warring species, advocating for human integration in the galactic order. That had made her dangerous. A woman with too many allies, too many ideas that threatened the old hierarchies. And now, with a single decree, they would remove her as easily as a smudge on a polished surface. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Though executions were common for traitors, few had expected this one to proceed so swiftly. A trial was usually a spectacle, a drawn-out affair to remind the galaxy of the Council's power. But Lyra was different. Delaying her death would only give her allies time to rally. Jarthos gestured, and the executioner approached, a towering reptilian figure clad in ceremonial robes, carrying a staff that crackled with contained plasma. Lyra's heart pounded, but she refused to let fear show. "You do not understand what you're doing," she said, voice steady. "I am not just a human. I am the wife of General Marcus Kane." Silence fell over the chamber. The name sent a ripple of recognition through the assembled councillors. Even those unfamiliar with human military affairs knew of Kane, a strategist, a warrior, a man who had led brutal campaigns during the frontier wars. His name was synonymous with destruction. Jarthos did not flinch. "Your lineage is irrelevant. Whatever your husband's rank, he is not here. And he will not save you." Lyra closed her eyes. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the revelation would give them pause. That they would hesitate, if only to reconsider the consequences. But arrogance was a disease that thrived in places of unchecked power. The executioner raised the staff, and a blinding arc of plasma ignited around her. Pain, searing, absolute, tore through her body. A single cry escaped her lips before it was swallowed by the roaring inferno. The chamber filled with an eerie light as her silhouette twisted within the flames. The councillors watched, impassive. To them, she was already a ghost, her existence erased the moment the decree was signed. When the fire finally dissipated, nothing remained but scorched metal. Jarthos turned to the assembly. "Let it be known that the Galactic Council does not tolerate dissent. This judgment is final." A functionary stepped forward, holding a datapad. "High Arbiter, the formal death notice must be transmitted to the appropriate parties." Jarthos waved a dismissive hand. "Send it to whatever human authority claims jurisdiction. They will know that justice has been served." The functionary hesitated. "Sir, the next of kin is listed as General Marcus Kane." Jarthos's mandibles twitched, a small but noticeable sign of unease. The chamber had returned to murmurs, but now the whispers held a different tone. Kane was a soldier of legend, feared even among those who despised humanity. He had retired from war, disappearing into the solitude of deep space, but men like him did not simply fade. They waited. Jarthos straightened. "Send the message." The functionary tapped the pad, and across the vastness of space, a single transmission left the Council's network. A simple notification. A name. A crime. A confirmation of execution. It would take days, perhaps weeks, to reach its destination. But when it did, the Council would learn the true cost of their mistake. The transmission reached the outer rim of human space, a mere flicker among the countless data streams coursing through the void. It traveled past derelict stations and abandoned battlefields, remnants of wars fought long ago. Eventually, it reached a secure military relay, where automated systems sorted through the countless bureaucratic missives and casualty reports. It was there, in the silent corridors of a forgotten command post, that the name Marcus Kane surfaced. A lone officer, stationed at the outpost more out of duty than necessity, read the notification twice. Then a third time. The blood drained from his face as he realized what it meant. Without hesitation, he accessed a restricted channel and sent a direct, high-priority pulse message. There was only one recipient. Deep within an isolated sector, beyond the borders of charted space, Marcus Kane sat in his cabin aboard the Revenant. The ship, once a feared dreadnought, now drifted in quiet solitude, its systems humming at minimal power. Kane had spent years in exile, withdrawing from the politics and conflicts of the galaxy. He had given up war, given up the weight of command, choosing instead to live in the silence of the void. But silence was fragile. The notification appeared on his private console. A simple report. Lyra Kane, executed by order of the Galactic Council. Plasma immolation. He read it once, then again, the words blurring as his mind rejected their meaning. His hands clenched into fists. A deep, slow breath filled his lungs, but it did nothing to calm the storm building inside him. His chest felt hollow, as if something vital had been ripped from it. The edges of his vision darkened, not with grief, but with something older, something buried. It had been years since he had last worn his uniform. Years since he had last issued a command. He had promised her, promised himself, that he would never go back. That he would never again become the man the galaxy had feared. But they had taken her from him. Kane stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He stepped toward the console, his fingers gliding over the controls with a precision that had never dulled. The ship came alive around him, systems surging back to full power, engines rumbling like a beast stirred from slumber. The dim emergency lights brightened to war mode, casting the cabin in deep crimson. He opened a secure channel. The kind that only a handful of people in the galaxy could access. A moment later, a grainy hologram flickered to life, a scarred man in battered armor, his expression unreadable. "General." Kane's voice was steel. "Assemble the old crew. Call in every favor, every debt. We move in 72 hours. The man nodded once, then the feed cut out. Kane turned to the viewport, staring into the endless void. For years, the galaxy had known peace. For years, he had allowed the Council to believe that he was done. They would learn their mistake soon enough. Word spread like wildfire. From the fringes of human space to the heart of the old war zones, soldiers, mercenaries, and outcasts heard the call. The name Marcus Kane carried weight, more than a legend, more than a ghost of past battles. It was a storm gathering on the horizon. Ships that had not flown in decades were pulled from forgotten docks. Weapons were loaded, armor polished, war machines refitted for a campaign that no one had foreseen. The old alliances reawakened, men and women who had once fought under Kane's banner answering the call without hesitation. Among them was Admiral Rourke, a veteran of the frontier wars, who had once led fleets against impossible odds. When he received Kane's message, he simply sent a single reply, "Where do you need me?" Kane stood at the bridge of the Revenant, his fingers resting on the console as data poured in, fleet movements, supply routes, strategic targets. He did not need to ask for help. They had all been waiting for something like this. Revenge was a powerful motivator. A lone officer aboard a Galactic Council station reviewed a routine scan report. Unidentified vessels had been spotted near restricted zones, nothing overt, just whispers in the dark. He frowned. The pattern was familiar. It stirred something in the back of his mind, an old fear buried beneath years of peacetime complacency. He hesitated before sending a brief, almost casual note up the chain of command. No one paid attention. The Council had grown arrogant in its dominance. They had crushed rebellions before, silenced dissidents with impunity. To them, the execution of a single human woman was nothing more than a formality, a bureaucratic decision made without concern for its consequences. They did not realize that consequences were already coming for them. Aboard the Revenant, Kane watched the final preparations unfold. His fleet was smaller than it had once been, but it was efficient, honed for precision strikes. He had no interest in conquest. This was not a war of territory, not a struggle for power. It was retribution. He studied the holographic projection of the Galactic Council's capital world, his eyes narrowing. He would not waste time with threats or warnings. By the time they understood what was happening, it would already be too late. The ship's comm activated, and Admiral Rourke's voice came through. "The fleet is ready, General." "Orders." Kane exhaled slowly. The rage inside him was cold now, sharpened into something lethal. "Set course for the Council's homeworld," he said. "We begin now." The Galactic Council's capital world, Varan Prime, had never known war. Its skies were a constant shade of deep violet, its vast cityscapes untouched by the scars of conflict. Shields encased its towering structures, a symbol of its invulnerability, an arrogance built over centuries of uncontested rule. No enemy had ever reached its surface. No fleet had ever dared. Until now. The first sign of intrusion was a flicker in the outermost defense grid, nothing more than a ripple in the vast web of sensors that surrounded the planet. Automated systems logged it as a minor fluctuation. Routine. Unimportant. Minutes later, the main orbital station lost contact with 3 of its long-range patrols. Then 5. Then 7. By the time the Council security forces realized they were under attack, the Revenant had already slipped past their outer defenses. It moved like a phantom, an artifact of an older, more brutal time, its hull scarred from wars long buried in history. Kane stood at the helm, his expression carved from stone as he watched the chaos unfold on the monitors before him. Admiral Rourke's voice came through the comm. "They're scrambling fighters. Their fleets are too far out for immediate response. If we move now, we'll be inside the capital before they can react." Kane's fingers tightened around the console. He could hear the tension in Rourke's voice. This was no simple assault. It was something that had never been done before. "Proceed," Kane said. The attack was precise. Calculated. No wasted movement. The first wave targeted the planetary defense network, hacking into its systems, turning its own automated turrets against itself. Explosions rippled through the sky as the planet's outer shields flickered and collapsed, exposing the city below. Then came the descent. Kane led the charge himself, his dropship carving through the atmosphere like a falling blade. The city's spires rose to meet him, gleaming structures of silver and obsidian. Below, sirens wailed, citizens scattering in blind panic as the first explosions thundered through the streets. They had never known war. But they would know it now. Kane's boots hit the ground, and the impact sent a shock up his spine. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of burning metal curling in his lungs. Around him, his soldiers moved with ruthless efficiency, cutting through the Council's guards like a storm through brittle glass. There was no mercy here. No negotiation. The Council had shown none when they burned Lyra alive. The path to the Grand Chamber was lined with resistance, but it was feeble at best. The guards, accustomed to standing as symbols of authority rather than true warriors, fell with barely a fight. Kane did not slow. Every step was measured, every movement purposeful. His thoughts were quiet now, the raging grief within him distilled into singular intent. Ahead, the chamber doors loomed, massive and unyielding. A place where rulers sat untouched, believing themselves untouchable. He raised his weapon. A single, deafening blast tore the doors from their hinges. Inside, the Council sat in stunned silence, their towering seats of power casting long shadows across the room. Jarthos, golden and regal, stood frozen, his compound eyes reflecting the destruction Kane had wrought. "You," the High Arbiter breathed, the word almost lost in the distant sounds of battle. Kane stepped forward. The weight of the galaxy seemed to press against him, but he felt nothing. Only the cold, steady pulse of vengeance. "You burned my wife," he said. His voice was quiet. Steady. Jarthos straightened, his hands curling into fists. "She was a traitor. She." The shot was instant. A clean, precise bullet that shattered Jarthos' skull, sending golden ichor spraying across the pristine marble floor. The High Arbiter collapsed without another word. The silence that followed was suffocating. The remaining councillors trembled, their arrogance stripped away in an instant. They had played God for centuries, passing judgment with impunity. Now, judgment had come for them. Kane lowered his weapon. "Your rule ends today." One councillor, desperate, fell to his knees. "Please," he gasped. We can negotiate." Kane looked down at him, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned away. Behind him, his soldiers understood the command that had not been spoken. The chamber filled with gunfire. Kane stepped out into the ruined city, the night sky burning above him. Smoke rose in thick plumes, the world beneath his feet trembling as the last remnants of the Council's power crumbled to ash. It was over. But as he looked out over the devastation, he felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. The emptiness remained. Lyra was still gone. The war had been won. And yet, victory had never felt so hollow. The fires still burned long after the battle had ended. Varan Prime, once the untouchable heart of the Galactic Council, now lay in ruin. The sky, once a deep violet, was choked with ash, the glow of smouldering wreckage casting flickering shadows across the shattered cityscape. What had once been a monument to power was now a graveyard of arrogance. Marcus Kane stood at the edge of the Grand Chamber's ruins, the scent of charred metal thick in the air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant crackle of fire and the occasional echo of collapsing stone. His soldiers moved through the remains of the Council citadel, sweeping for survivors, securing key locations, but their purpose felt irrelevant now. The war had been waged, the enemy destroyed. And yet, Kane felt none of the closure he had sought. Admiral Rourke approached, his boots crunching over debris. His armor was scorched, his expression grim. "It's done," he said. Kane said nothing. Rourke exhaled, running a hand over his beard. "What now?" That was the question, wasn't it? He had spent years in exile, burying the warrior he once was, telling himself that peace, true peace, was worth more than vengeance. But vengeance had called him back, pulled him into its cold embrace, and now that it was done, there was nothing left. Kane turned, surveying the destruction with tired eyes. The Council was gone. The power that had burned Lyra alive had been reduced to rubble. But as he looked out over the ruined world, he saw something else. Fear. The civilians who had survived the siege remained hidden in the shadows, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling. They had been taught that the Council was absolute, that its rule was law, that no force could ever challenge it. Now, they looked at Kane as though he was something worse. A conqueror. A warlord. A monster. Was that what he had become? He clenched his jaw, forcing the thought away. None of it mattered. The Council had passed its judgment on Lyra. He had passed his judgment on them. The cycle was complete. Rourke shifted uncomfortably. The fleet is still holding in orbit. Word is spreading. Some of the outer systems are already declaring independence. Others are waiting to see what we do next. Kane looked at him. They expect us to rule. Rourke hesitated before nodding. You wiped out the highest authority in the galaxy. Like it or not, people are going to look for someone to fill that void. Kane exhaled slowly. He had no desire for power, no interest in governing the same corrupt system he had just torn down. But power was a vacuum, and in the absence of control, chaos would spread like wildfire. He had seen it before, in the aftermath of the frontier wars. He had fought wars to end tyranny, only to watch new tyrants rise from the ashes. The thought of staying, of shaping what came next, felt unbearable. But abandoning it, that felt worse. He turned away from the ruins, walking toward the edge of the courtyard where his ship waited. He could feel Rourke watching him, waiting for an answer he wasn't sure he could give. "We set things right," Kane said finally. His voice was quiet but certain. "Then we leave." Rourke nodded, understanding more than Kane said. The war was over. The aftermath had just begun.